All righty. Well, we are at 12:01 for me and everybody else on Central Time. I'm sure there's people across the country joining, but I will get started. And I see a few other people trickling in. But we'll get started. Everything will be recorded, as I'll talk about on one of the early slides here. But we want to make sure we get through all of the content and have plenty of time at the end for questions. So I will jump right in. And for starters, I really appreciate everybody jumping on with us today. I know it's a very, very busy time of year for all teams as we make the final push before the holidays. So it's not lost on us that you're taking time out of your day to join us on an accessibility webinar. This is a fun topic. I'm really looking forward to this webinar. I think it's a unique topic, and I always think that makes for highly engaged audiences and highly engaged content. So to start, I always like to do a 30,000-foot overview on who Allyant is. If we have anybody in the audience who doesn't have any experience with our team or sort of what we do from an accessibility perspective, by way of jumping straight into that, we are sort of a holistic accessibility solutions and communications provider for our clients. So we do all things accessibility. By way of that, and by what I mean by that is we focus on digital accessibility, which is largely the focus of today's conversation. So procurement, accessibility, procurement for software, etc. But we also do document accessibility. I have a best-in-class team that does remediation of documents and also best-in-class software under the Common Look suite of products for plugins to Adobe, Microsoft Office, etc. And then we also do alternative format, so large flow reprint, printing in Braille, etc. And by way of that, we are the industry's only full service solutions provider as it relates to accessible communications. With that, I'll kind of jump into a brief introduction to the speakers today, and I'll kick it off to you, AP, because I know this is a very very important topic to you and one that's very near and dear to you because you have a lot of background in accessible procurement. So I'll kick it to you first.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Hi, everybody. It's nice to get to talk to you today. My name is Aaron Page. You may hear Ryan refer to me as AP for short. When we first got started at formerly Accessible 360, we had multiple Aarons around. And so I got the code name AP for short. So if you hear that, that's who he is referring to. My title at Allyant is I am Director of Accessibility. So I head up our digital auditing teams to remain conform with the latest and greatest versions of WCAG. I also head up our litigation support team that helps our clients in the event they're targeted by accessibility-related lawsuits, demand letters, that type of thing. I myself am blind. I was born with congenital glaucoma, lost my remaining functional vision about 16 years ago now. Not too long after I lost my vision, I actually went back to school. I enrolled at the University of Montana. And for those of you who are in the higher education space, you might hear University of Montana might ring a few bells. Because the University of Montana was actually targeted by an Office of Civil Rights complaint in 2012. And so while I was a blind student at the University of Montana, they actually brought me on as really a kind of student advisor around accessibility. And that was where I really first got introduced into the area of digital accessibility. And this particular topic that we're going to talk a lot about today, procurement accessibility, procuring software and tools that will either be accessible or help you create accessible content, was a huge topic of discussion and something that required a lot of policy and procedures around. And so I'm really looking forward to getting to talk to you all more about this topic today. Ryan, hand it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, AP. And a brief introduction into me and my role. So I'll be kind of running the slides today. I think Aaron will add a lot of the amazing content as always. My official role and title here at Allyant is VP of Digital Accessibility Sales. So I know a little bit about documents and alternate format, but most all of my background in accessibility is in the digital space. So helping clients build roadmaps, really for a global footprint. I work with clients here in the US, in Canada, Europe, Asia, Australia. I get the chance to meet and greet a lot of people and help them build out accessibility roadmaps to ensure they are providing digitally accessible communications to their consumers or employees. And where the procurement topic is very near and dear to me is through a lot of the work that, and we'll touch on this, that we have been doing with disability in Procure Access. So I've got a lot of experience in sort of a crash course on procurement accessibility over the last 6 months. And I think it's really a really expanding area in the line of digital accessibility. So very excited to be presenting on this topic for everyone today. With that, I'll go through some broad webinar housekeeping. One thing, and I know AP and I talk about this all the time on webinars, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So please, if you have questions in real time, I do have the question and Q&A panel up on another screen, and I will do my best to keep an eye on that and try to jump to questions in real time as they flow in. So if you have a question in real time or just generally, we can definitely jump to those as they flow in, and we should have plenty of time at the end for questions as well. The second thing is the recording will be distributed. So we are recording this, our marketing team, and then obviously some team members from our side will be following up with the recording as soon as we have it prepared for everyone. And then it will be posted on our website as well. So if you have to jump, if you have other team members that were hoping to join and they weren't able to make it, or something in here rings a bell and you do want to share it with your procurement team, we will be distributing the recording and you'll be able to access it at any time via that. Last but not least, reach out at any time. You can always reach us via our website, Allyant.com, sales@Allyant.com. You can find Aaron and I on LinkedIn. We'd be happy and love to connect and sort of chat there as well. So you can reach out to us at any time. We love talking accessibility with everybody and anybody. As it relates to today's webinar agenda, we're kind of going to run through a background on what in the world is procurement accessibility, and more specifically, I think on the leading edge of the webinar, what are the challenges that teams face when they try to bridge that gap between accessibility teams, accessible technology, and then procurement teams. So we're going to run through some of the things that we have seen in this space. Obviously, we'll pull on Aaron's background a lot because he lived this as a full role, as he alluded to in his introduction. And then on the back end of the webinar, we'll really dive into a new free service offering that we have called ProcureEnsure. And that's going to be a big topic of conversation from our perspective, because we do believe we have built something that is a free service from our Allyant perspective that can really help solve some of these challenges that we're seeing in procurement accessibility. With that, I'll kind of jump into sort of a kickoff to the conversation. So really at a baseline level, right? We're talking about procurement, we're talking about accessibility, and how do these two things play together? When we think about procurement accessibility here at Allyant, we're really talking and helping support teams on ensuring software or products that they procure are accessible, and in really making sure that regardless of the type of software that you're looking to procure, whether it's something that goes on your website, like a chatbot, a loan calculator, if you're a financial institution, if you use any sort of like contact forms that are third parties or run through a widget, could be something much more complex, like a learning management system. If you're in higher ed or K through 12 education, employee systems, HR software, it really is a very broad horizon. And I think a big part of procurement accessibility is just ensuring that there's awareness to the fact that these are going to be deployed to consumers and internal employees. So ensuring you're sort of crossing that bridge at the front end, as we'll get into on the next slide of why this is important. But specifically, AP, I'd love to hand it to you because you, like I said, you have a lot of background in this, and I'd love to hear from your, intimate perspective. What does procurement accessibility mean to you? Because you lived this for a long time.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Really, just as you said, it really is the process of attempting to go about procuring hardware, software, any other information communications technologies, electronic information technologies, whatever kind of acronym you want to use, but that are accessible. And as we'll really dive into in some of these kind of subsequent slides, there's a lot that goes into that. A lot of considerations you have to think of from a process standpoint, like what do you do in a scenario where there might not be a particularly accessible solution? What do you do when you get a VPAT? What do you do when you have a vendor who is just not responsive to accessibility complaints? And these all really kind of factor into developing a good roadmap and strategy for making sure that those technologies that you're procuring are in fact going to be accessible and aren't going to create barriers for those end users who you allude to, because they're ultimately the ones who are going to be impacted by it. And you, usually the institution, especially when we talk about in the higher ed space, just as we really saw with the University of Montana when they were called out in their civil rights complaint, the institution using the technology is the one who will be responsible for that, not necessarily the vendor who sold that technology to you.
Yeah, and AP, that's a perfect segue into the next slide. So perfect setup on your end. And that dives into why is procurement accessibility important? And I always say when I'm working with organizations that are looking to sort of either deploy our new service ProcureEnsure that we'll get into, or just holistically asking questions on, is something that we're putting on our website, is a software that we're looking to deploy internally to our employees, is it accessible? I think the biggest thing that I always talk about and really stress to clients is prioritizing accessibility in the procurement process requires vendors to also prioritize accessibility. I think the biggest challenge that a lot of teams face when we think about this topic is they procure a software. So, and we've all been there, right? Marketing procures something, IT, people services, sales, whoever it is, someone procures something, they sign a 2 or 3 year agreement. You then deploy that software, and at that point in time, either through an internal accessibility team, through a customer complaint, in extreme cases, maybe through a lawsuit, you sort of find out that that product or software is not accessible. The challenge then is it's much harder to obviously pick a new vendor, reinstall the system after you've purchased and deployed it. It's a lot harder for procurement or legal to go back and say, hey, we want accessibility contract language in. In fact, it's too late, right? So I think one of the biggest things we like to help organizations and clients understand is when you prioritize accessibility internally in the procurement process, when you're going through that RFP, through that RFI, or going in that final vendor sort of conversation in contract negotiation, by prioritizing accessibility internally in procurement, you're also requiring your vendors to sort of prioritize accessibility. And then you can do this before it's too late. In AP, I'll kind of jump to you then, because we've actually seen some instances of this. I don't think we want to talk about them specifically, but the fact that this is also becomes, as you lived at University of Montana, and then some instances that we see through your leading of our accessibility claims team, we are seeing that there's a legal responsibility to this, right? Like if you pick a vendor or a software deployed on your website, that always ultimately falls on you.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I'll caveat this by saying I am not a lawyer, neither is Ryan. We at Allyant don't provide legal advice, so none of this should be construed as that. But certainly when you look at the landscape and how entities have been held responsible for this, it certainly does seem to be the case. I tend to think of it really as an accessibility expert, as a kind of donut hole, because really, if you procure a piece of technology, even if you might actually have been told, oh yeah, our software is accessible, which 99% of the time, if you just simply ask a vendor, is your software accessible? The answer you're going to get from them is yes. They're very rarely going to come out and say, oh, we don't know what accessibility is, or we haven't done anything on that front. They're going to say yes. And you might take that really at that face value, implement that piece of software, come to find out that it now creates an accessibility barrier, a significant accessibility barrier for users. And then you are the one who's going to be responsible for that, because ultimately you're the institution, especially when we talk about the higher ed space. You're the one who's falling under Section 508. You're the one who had the obligation to procure that accessible technology. And so unless you happen to have included some type of a contract language in your procurement contract that says, this vendor made a guarantee, they are indemnifying us against any accessibility claims, which is exceedingly rare, then you are likely going to be the one who's going to be held responsible for the inaccessibility of that product, even though you might have actually taken it on a good faith claim by the vendor that it was accessible. I do hear my screen reader is rattling off to me that somebody is raising and lowering their hand. I don't know if we happen to have a question going on in the chat, Ryan, that we might want to respond to.
I don't see one. I also saw that as well. I saw it go up and down about 15 times, AP, and I was actually going to ask if anybody had a question that was raising their hand, because I was going to safely assume that your screen reader was going to be rattling that off left and right.
It was, yeah. Robert Feldman, calling on you, raising and lowering your hand. Do you have a question for us?
Awesome. Maybe it was a Zoom error, but
right.
Thanks, AP. No, it's perfect overview. So I will jump into the next slide. And like I said early on, if you have any questions, just post them in the Q&A channel, and we will get to them in real time or ASAP. And then jumping into the next slide, I think this is one that really comes to mind on this topic for me, and that is, what challenges are we seeing teams face? And I think my first really strong exposure to this, quite frankly, was this past July at the Disability Inc. conference. And If your team is looking to attend an accessibility conference or a DEI focused conference, I would strongly recommend the Disability In conference. It was quite insightful. A lot of amazing, like-minded accessibility champions all in one place talking about accessibility, and procurement tended to come up quite a bit. And the reason for that is there was a lot of procurement professionals at Disability In, there was a lot of accessibility professionals at Disability In. And I think one of the common themes, and we in AP and I've continued to see this sort of after the fact, and in rolling out ProcureEnsure to support this process, one of the biggest challenges that I think teams face internally every single day is that procurement teams, your procurement team is likely not trained in accessibility. They might not even understand what WCAG is, what a VPAT is, what they should ask of vendor as they're going through procurement. So I think a lot of times it's hard to implement procurement accessibility when procurement folks are amazing at what they do. They're amazing at finding vendors, going through those contract processes, and building really consistent and seamless flows within, procuring software and technology, but they aren't accessibility experts. And I think that's a big challenge that a lot of teams face. And I think the other challenge that procurement faces when they think about procuring accessible technology, and where accessibility can be a barrier to that, is time to test. I heard consistently from procurement teams that at Disability that we want to test for accessibility, and we really want to deploy Disability In's Procure Access, and we're adopting that. But when we go back to our internal accessibility team, a lot of times, and I'm sure we have accessibility folks on the call that run internal accessibility teams, you're probably super busy, right? It takes you not only a couple of days, but many times 6, 8, 12, I heard 3 months at the conference to get an accessibility assessment done. Well, anyone who's looking to procure software doesn't want to wait that long. And in AP, I don't know if you have any thoughts from your background at the University of Montana, but I think it's a big challenge for teams, right? Having access to efficient, in almost like real-time testing, so that when someone's going through the procurement process, accessibility doesn't slow that down by, again, 6, 8, 12 weeks, right? Because no one wants to hear that when they're looking to deploy something.
Right, absolutely. Creates a very large bottleneck, and it certainly was something we experienced in this at the University of Montana. Oftentimes, you'll see this as part of a requirement in settlement agreements, things like that, where you are actually required to conduct your own independent assessment of accessibility. So you simply aren't allowed to just take a VPAT or to take it at that face value. You're required to conduct your own independent accessibility evaluation. And that was part of the settlement agreement that the University of Montana ultimately ended up having to agree to. And so part of my role as I was brought on at the university as a student initially, later as a staff member, was conducting these assessments. And so really just being able in those situations when you have a VPAT to take the VPAT and see, okay, this VPAT says they conform to 131. Now let's go look at the application and see, does it actually seem like that is in fact the case? The ironic thing is that the actual assessments themselves often wouldn't necessarily take that long, especially when you think of oftentimes the quality you see from VPATs that are created by an independent auditing company like Allyant or some others in the space. Whenever you have a VPAT that is created internally, it usually was very quick to see the results didn't tend to be very accurate from those. It didn't take a particularly longer in-depth assessment to do. However, the logistics around that could actually take a very long time getting access to be able to test the software, understanding what it is about the software that in fact actually needs to be tested. And then when you think of the amount of software and the amount of technologies that larger organizations or institutions tend to procure, if all you have is a 1 or 2 person accessibility team, which was certainly the case we had at the university, they only had 1 staff member who was conducting these assessments. It created a tremendous backlog. And as Brian, you really said it, your senior stakeholders, your deans and your presidents and your provosts, they especially don't want to wait 6 weeks, 8 weeks to have that accessibility evaluation conducted. They want to be able to turn those things around much more quickly. And so you don't want your accessibility assessment to become a barrier to being able to do that.
Yeah, spot on, AP. And I think that, your background in having lived that in a full-time role really adds great context to that. And again, it's one of the biggest challenges that I heard at the conference and in post-conference from teams is the accessibility testing just takes too long, right? And it's whether it's procurement or not. I think we hear that all the time as well, right? When someone's in a release cycle, they're designing a new website or designing a new application, they also don't want it to take 6 weeks. So we're kind of playing that sort of time to deliver and accessibility from multiple fronts. And I think the final one in AP, I think it's great when it comes from you because you are a user of assistive technology yourself. But I think another big challenge that teams face, or procurement teams face, and a big pressure that they face is when we prioritize accessibility, we're going to be sacrificing product features. And I don't think this is just related to procurement, right? I think this is something we hear all the time as accessibility professionals and helping teams map out accessibility. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that, right? I think it's, sales or IT or marketing saying, well, if we do an accessibility assessment, it might come back bad, and then we're reducing features. I personally, I don't believe in this, but I think it's good coming from you in your background. So what are your thoughts on the misconception that prioritizing accessibility will sacrifice product features?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think the best tools that you see out there are tools that empower you to be able to create accessible content, or that empower users with the accessibility that they need to start off with, without having to necessarily limit the feature set, or they at least inform you of what is possible, what is not possible from an accessibility standpoint. And that I think is when you get into the procurement space, is a really big part of it. There is no such thing as perfect, right? If your goal is, we want to find something that is 100% perfect, that has no accessibility issues that we'll ever find, good luck. Chances are you're going to really struggle to be able to find something like that. And so knowing is everything. Knowing, here's what they had to say about the accessibility. Here's what our independent assessment found about its accessibility, and then being able to plan for what to do in the situation that somebody needs to use this technology but might run into a known accessibility barrier. And that was really a large part of the work that we did at the University of Montana in conducting our kind of independent accessibility evaluations. What seems possible and what is not. And in the event a student or a staff member, whomever it might be, is going to be impacted by the part of the technology that's not accessible, what do we do? And at the university, we actually had it was called an EEAA, Plan for Equally Effective Alternative Access. And so if the accessibility assessment found that some parts of the application might not necessarily be accessible, that didn't mean that it was now dead and it can't move forward. Now you know, though, and you can plan for that. Because very oftentimes, it's unfortunate, certainly not how I want it to be, but sometimes you're going to run into a situation where there is no quote unquote accessible option. And you have to, from the least of the kind of bad options, know what the limitations are and plan for it accordingly.
Yeah, super helpful, AP. And we did get a question that I think we can just answer in real time before I jump to the next slide. Dave asked, is the OCR case against the University of Montana from 2014? So obviously you'd know that.
Is it 2014? I thought it was 2012 off the top of my head. It feels like so long ago. But yes, right around that time frame. 2012, 2014. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you, AP. And then moving on, and I think this is one that's near and dear to both certainly AP's heart and mine as well, and that is, what type of testing is needed? And I think this is another challenge that I'm seeing in the space. I'll kind of go bottom to top on this slide if you do happen to be watching along on the webinar and looking at the screen. Then that is, vendors may want procurement assessments done by a third party. And I think this is one of the biggest reasons why ProcureEnsure has really helped our clients and helped the marketplace. Is I have heard from a lot of enterprise organizations and higher education institutions, et cetera, that even if they have an internal accessibility team, which many of them do that are leveraging ProcureEnsure, it's either a bandwidth issue or the vendor that they're looking to procure says, I want this assessment done by a third party. And ironically, AP, it's not that much different than when and we'll talk about this on the next slide, we sort of tell our clients that if they do obtain a VPAT from the vendor, make sure it's third party. So we're kind of playing this in both sides and hearing it from both sides. Because if you're a vendor, the feedback that I've seen from organizations is they say, well, of course you're going to say it's not accessible because that's leverage in the contract negotiation. And I do think all of these organizations have 100% best interest at heart. but it does add a layer to us sort of launching ProcureEnsure into the market and providing that third-party procurement support that we'll talk about more as we go along. With that said, I think one of the biggest things that you can talk about, AP, is the fact that, when we think about doing procurement assessments, and most times this is on complex software, right? Most teams aren't looking to just simply procure a 2-page WordPress site. That would be kind of unapplicable. So when we think about very complex software, and specifically with the launch of 2.2, and Aaron did a recent webinar on 2.2. If you missed that, we'd be happy to provide the link as well, where we really dove into the fact that live user testing is critical. And it's especially critical, I feel like, AP, in procurement, because ultimately organizations, those on the call or others that we're working with, are going to deploy this to end users that are leveraging assistive technology and living with these disabilities. So I'll let you jump in and kind of give your 2 cents on the strong sort of need for procurement assessments to include live user testing and people living with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in some situations, you might actually even be required to ensure that that testing is conducted by live users with disabilities, again, as part of a settlement agreement, or something to that effect. Um, Sorry, losing my train of thought here. One point I would say around this that underscores why it's very important to do live user testing is when you think about the different types of software that are out there. So yes, you have websites and web applications, but you also have desktop software, desktop applications, native mobile software and applications. And so, yes, you might theoretically be able to go and run the Wave scanner or our own Hub toolkit, or other competitors' web-based accessibility conformance tools. You might be able to run them against individual pages of something like a website or a dedicated web application. But I think those of you who have really been in the accessibility space for a long time know and understand that these types of automated scanning tools, at best, they usually find somewhere between a quarter and a third of accessibility issues. And they tend to create a lot of white noise along the way in terms of false positives, non-issues, usability recommendations, and that type of thing. Some of these tools are more upfront about it than others. Wave, for example, if you actually go and read their terms of service, they specifically say that Wave cannot be used to measure whether or not a site discriminates against a user or would deny them equal access. It's not intended to be able to do that. And the Department of Justice and others have really recognized this point, that an automated scanning tool by itself cannot determine whether or not a website or a web app, that type of thing, is conformant to the WCAG, and if it does or does not discriminate against users. And that's just talking websites and web-based applications. When you get into your desktop applications or your native mobile applications, those types of scanning tools really aren't out there. There's 1 or 2 that are kind of out there that are extremely hard to get to, very niche, and not something that's really just available for anybody to be able to go and use. Really, what you use is that live user testing. And I will say, one advantage in particular to focusing on live user testing, especially around users who are blind and use screen reading software. We often get this question when performing an accessibility audit. Well, should we audit also with Dragon Naturally Speaking? Should we also audit with Zoom Text? Should we audit with a sit puff switch? Should we audit with all of these other different types of assistive technologies? And not to say there wouldn't be any value in doing that, but from an efficiency and a cost perspective, it's just not possible or realistic to throw all of these different assistive technologies and all of these different configurations at a particular piece of software that you're looking to consider procuring. And by focusing your testing really on blind users, those users who rely on screen reading software, I like to think of it as the least common denominator. If it works for screen reading software, it's very likely going to work for other assistive technologies. If I, as a screen reader user, am able to tab between the controls and interact with those controls, it's very likely that a keyboard-only user is going to be able to do the same thing. If I, as a screen reader user, am hearing all of your controls are properly labeled, then somebody who's using Dragon Naturally Speaking is going to be able to, using just their voice and the assistive technology, interact with those tools. And so if you're looking for really what is the one configuration you can test that will have the broadest range of impact? Focusing that in on users of screen reading software is a good way to do it because they tend to have the most onerous requirements. And if it works for them, it's a good chance it's going to work for others as well. Guaranteed to no, but certainly that's if you're looking for your one testing option, that live user testing by persons with disabilities who are blind, low vision, and actually use the screen reading software on a daily basis, that's your best option to be able to do it.
That was a perfect answer, AP, as always. So I certainly appreciate it. And I'll kind of jump on to the next one. And that is, before we get into sort of talking about how we've helped solve this challenge for clients and what ProcureEnsure is and how teams can leverage this, I'll jump in on what if we receive a VPAT, right? I think this is one of our favorite questions, and we hear this all the time. I was talking with a bunch of procurement folks last week, and one of their questions was, well, we require vendors to provide a VPAT. And when you dig a little bit deeper in, we kind of come full circle on, does procurement understand, how to decipher that VPAT? And in their case, they didn't, right? They didn't know what the VPAT was even saying. They didn't know what it meant. And one thing that I always caution, and we won't spend too much time on this because we talked a lot about it on a recent VPAT webinar, is sort of understanding the nature of VPAT. The first word in the V, the letter V stands for, is voluntary, right? And is a voluntary assessment really going to sort of touch on all things that are required for accessibility, and is it going to be in good faith? And I think one of the biggest things, AP, you and I help consult teams on all the time is ensuring that a third-party VPAT is done, right? This was done by a subjective third party. The testing was done by them, and if you're going to require this in procurement, ensure that VPAT is delivered by a third party, be it Allyant or any of the other amazing accessibility vendors in the space. So I'll kind of let you add your thoughts on that, AP. I think you have some great insight from how you all deciphered VPATs or versus third-party VPATs at the University of Montana. That's very useful.
Yeah, it's a great point about third-party VPATs. VPATs that are being created by the vendor themselves. So if I'm selling a piece of software and I'd have my development team actually write the VPAT for it. Many organizations that we've talked to in the procurement space, and certainly this was our stance at the University of Montana, is that we give those very little weight. We had some organizations tell us they just disregard them, they'll throw them in the trash if it wasn't created by an independent accessibility vendor in the space. So I think really it's becoming almost table stakes now for being able to get your VPAT any credibility, is that it has to reflect that it is coming from that outsized vendor. And then, other questions that come up are, how accurate is the VPAT? And naturally, if you're getting it from an independent vendor, the likelihood that the information that is contained in that VPAT is accurate is certainly going to go up, and that it's going to be complete. Part of the ProcureEnsure offering that we will probably be talking a bit more about as we're moving through our slides is VPAT, what we call VPAT validation. And it's really just the idea of going through the VPAT to see, okay, they are alleging that keyboard only 2.1.1 that they support. They don't have any disclaimers, any caveats in their VPAT that says it's not supported. So let's find out if we go and we do a quick assessment for a couple hours and we try to access it using nothing but the keyboard, are we in fact finding that that is actually the case? And if it's conducted by those third parties, the likelihood that that information is going to be accurate definitely goes up. But then there's also the question of, what do you do once you have it? And if you trust the information that it's in it, you believe that it is complete, how do you now use that to compare other pieces of software? What if you have 3 pieces of software in a given space that you are considering and you've received VPATs for them? How do you go about actually deciding, well, which one do you want to use? And so different organizations come up with their own kind of unique approaches. At the University of Montana, what we actually did was we gave VPATs a score. So depending on how you responded to each of the individual success criteria, different success criteria were weighted differently. And then depending on how you responded, support, partially support, does not support, you would get a score on that. And ultimately, that score gets tallied up at the end and it gives an overall score for the VPAT that you can then use to compare different VPATs of different products. And that's obviously just the one example of how at University of Montana we thought to approach it in order to be able to use the VPATs to really compare products was by generating that score. Other institutions, though, might come up with their own ways for how they want to read through VPATs, or even what they might want to prioritize in a VPAT. You might want to say, well, my priority is really focusing on those level A success criteria that are really going to hurt folks: non-text content, keyboard operability, focus visible, those types of things that are really going to create a barrier. That might be how you choose to prioritize the VPAT. Really, it's up to you. The VPAT is just a voluntary document that provides you with information, and how you choose to utilize and process that information is up to you.
Super helpful, AP. I appreciate you jumping in with sort of your background in hands-on experience in that space. With that, we'll sort of jump to now focusing more on what is ProcureEnsure, right? Like sort of the spirit of the webinar on the back end. Now that we've sort of laid out some, best recommendations on procurement accessibility, what is this? Kind of jumping to a service that we're very proud of having launched into the market that really is helping our clients in other organizations solve for procurement accessibility. I think one of the biggest things that I like to talk about and that I do consult with teams on all the time is really bridging the accessibility and procurement gap. I kind of teased this early on in the webinar. And I think one of the ways that we really help teams do that is kind of bringing both teams to the table. I think when we think about procurement and then we think about accessibility for internal projects and building accessibility roadmaps and doing testing on be it websites or products that organizations are developing and launching into the marketplace, I tend to find that procurement and accessibility tend to not work together a lot. And so I think one of the biggest ways that I personally have seen through Disability In and having a lot of these ProcureEnsure conversations, teams have really respected that it's brought both parties to the table, right? A lot of times procurement doesn't understand how they can support accessibility. And on the flip side of that, accessibility teams don't understand how they can support procurement. So some of our best practices, from the Allyant perspective in sort of launching ProcureEnsure and helping teams sort of solve for this challenge is really building a commitment to accessibility testing at some level in the procurement process, right? Just being aware of it. And I think, AP, you guys at the University of Montana built out a very robust process, but that takes time, right? It's like anything in accessibility. You're not going to solve this overnight. So just creating that awareness from the accessibility perspective or an internal resource group focused on disability, just kind of asking the questions like, hey, procurement, are we testing for accessibility? And can we do some level of accessibility testing in really supporting, the accessibility team on that side, at least making this a priority, right? And I think longer term, you can build much more robust processes and requirements of, whether it's through ProcureEnsure or other accessibility testing in the procurement process, like what is our output of this? But that can come down the line, right? It's like anything in accessibility, in AP, we talk about this all the time with clients, like you have to start somewhere, right? Never starting doesn't lead to any success. And I think what I often hear, and we've kind of talked about this a lot, is how accessibility can support procurement. And I think the number one way that accessibility teams can support procurement is giving them results quickly, right? And in AP, I don't know, would you agree with that? I think that's the biggest challenge because you've obviously lived the accessibility side of this from a procurement perspective. But I think that's the biggest challenge that we hear is procurement is constantly saying we can't wait forever to get these results. So I call that the biggest, the easy, really, really, really simple baby steps that teams can take to bridge accessibility and procurement. Procurement, just having an awareness of what is accessibility doing and why is it important and how can we, at some point, prioritize accessibility testing. And then from the accessibility team side, helping procurement get these results as quickly as possible. Anything to add there, AP? And then I'll kind of jump into ProcureEnsure more pointedly.
No, I think you really hit the nail on the head. I think that the biggest pain point, certainly from my experience back at the University of Montana, when we were dealing with this, always came down to timelines and the amount of time it took to conduct an accessibility assessment, to get actionable results, to get any purchase holds removed that relate to accessibility, and for them to be able to move forward. Because ultimately, this procurement department, they're likely be hearing from a dean or a provost, some senior executive stakeholder who really wants this software. And so the pressure really is just kind of shifting around at that point. So definitely, I think that getting results quickly is the number one thing that an accessibility team can do to make best friends with the procurement team.
Love it. We all love to be best friends. So then kind of jumping forward into ProcureEnsure, and how is this helping organizations and our clients really simplify this process, right? We've talked through the pain points, we've talked through the challenges of procuring accessible technology. And with that, we're really proud to have launched ProcureEnsure into the accessibility space, leveraging all of our vast experience in sort of accessibility testing and building out a world-class auditing staff and having these internal employees that AP will talk about in the next slide as far as the more, nitty-gritty process stuff with ProcureEnsure. But what basically ProcureEnsure is it is a free procurement assessment product that we have launched into the market. And sort of where this comes from, quite frankly, and sort of the why behind this was, I'll give a lot of credit to Dan Sullivan, my direct superior, our chief sales engineer here at Allyant, who's been in the space for many years. And Dan, in talking, I know at CSUN in March and with a lot of other individuals in the space and a lot of the stakeholders at Disability In, as they were launching Procure Access, which we are big proponents of as corporate sponsors of Disability In. We love that team. We love Procure Access. But one of the things Dan was hearing from the market is the big challenge with Procure Access was having the ability to actually test the software, right? Procurement teams were deploying the Procure Access toolkit. They were leveraging some of the contract language, but the big barrier to entry with really robustly deploying that was having a team that could do that testing. Dan tends to be a problem solver, and he quickly realized that as a strong proponent of Disability In and a lot of the team there, we have a very large auditing staff. We do this day in and day out for our customers. So we can fill that gap, right? Through our support of Disability In and really just helping teams procure accessible technology and make the internet and, quite frankly, all things digital more accessible. With ProcureEnsure, it is a totally free service. And we'll kind of jump to FAQs because I know the most common question I get on ProcureEnsure day in and day out is almost a disbelief that it is free. But basically what this is it's a free third-party software validation that will do, and AP will talk a little bit more about the details on the next slide. In almost every case, except for, of course, we're at a bad time of year, right? We're at the holidays. A lot of teams are on PTO and we have a lot of holiday days coming up here at Allyant. But in most cases, we're turning those results in 5 to 7 business days because that was the big challenge that we heard, from the marketplace, as we sort of alluded to in detail. So with that, AP, I'll kind of actually jump to you to kind of talk about the ProcureEnsure testing process and then the delivery process, because obviously we pulled a lot on your background. Dan did, I did, in building out this product and this service, and so we were afforded the opportunity of having someone who did this day in and day out for a long time. So I'll kind of have you talk about how we do the testing, who the testing is done by, the paired auditing process that we use, and then sort of the output of ProcureEnsure.
Yeah, thank you. ProcureEnsure really it takes a couple of different forms. There's 2 different potential forms, and really it comes down to whether you did or did not receive a VPAT for the software. The unfortunate fact is that the majority of times you ask that, they're not going to have one for you. And so we haven't had the opportunity to do this in response to a VPAT very much. But the idea is that if you have received a VPAT, then our goal is going to be to have one of our paired auditing teams. And so at Allyant, when we conduct audits in teams of 2, consisting of what we call a sighted auditor and a screen reader auditor. And so sighted auditor, their role is to be able to check for accessibility issues that impact persons with disabilities other than blindness, right? Closed captions, color contrast, focus indicators, that type of thing. And then the screen reader auditor, usually somebody like myself who is blind or somebody who is pretty significantly low vision, their role is to check and make sure that software is in fact accessible and usable for users of screen reading software. And so if you've got a VPAT, then what we will do is one of our paired auditing teams will actually take that VPAT and access the software. We have a bit of a form that you fill out. And one of the things that it asks for are credentials, how you can go about actually accessing the software to conduct the testing. And so we will take the information provided in that intake form and actually go access the software and spend a couple hours going through it to see, does what we are seeing as we review the software align with what is in fact being said in the VPATs. And if we're finding discrepancies, we will obviously make note of that, come back to you in the end with a report on the VPAT itself. And so we like to call that VPAT validation, just saying, okay, here's what the VPAT says, here's what our preliminary testing went and what we found, and providing that information. That's pretty rare because in the end, VPATs are still pretty rare. And so what ProcureEnsure usually takes the form of is a 2-hour assessment of the usability of the software, followed by a report that outlines, using a color coding, green, yellow, red, the idea of a stoplight, whether or not we feel it is conformant, whether we feel it has accessibility issues, but not necessarily so severe as to pose a super significant blocker, or if we feel like accessibility issues were found and were so significant as to prevent the user from being able to use the tool. And so these assessments are done in about 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours is what our goal is to do one of these. And I like to use Calendly as an example. It was really the example we used as the kind of proof of concept for this. And so how are most users going to engage if you were to purchase and use Calendly on your sites or for your organization? Yes, people do use it to manage their calendars on the back end, but the majority of users, the primary thing they are going to be doing is booking appointments, right? They're going to be clicking links in subject line, in email signatures, or going to a calendar form on your website, and they'll be using that to actually be able to set up an appointment with somebody. And so when we did a ProcureEnsure assessment on Calendly, that was the user flow that we focused on, actually going in and setting up an appointment on somebody's calendar using Calendly. And so we reviewed it with a cited auditor and a screen reader auditor, so a native user of screening software using actual screening software, to see, can they actually get through that user flow of booking an appointment? What types of accessibility issues were found in the process of doing that? And then ultimately, we wrote up a report that reflected that. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the color coding we use is green, yellow, red. And so in the example that we used for Calendly, we were able to complete that. I was able to, using my screening software, I was able to go through that entire flow. I was able to book an appointment. Did I find some accessibility issues though? Definitely, right? There were some accessibility issues that came up. One particular problem of note was that the time zone selector was a barrier. I was not able to actually choose a different time zone if I wanted to. However, since it defaulted to my current time zone, it didn't necessarily make it impossible for me to be able to book an appointment on Calendly. And so we ultimately gave Calendly, based on our ProcureEnsure assessment of that user flow of actually going in and booking a calendar appointment, we gave it the yellow rating because we did find accessibility issues, but we didn't find that they were so severe that they made it impossible to complete the task. And then alongside with that rating, we provided a high-level rundown of, here are several accessibility features, and here are several accessibility issues. And so obviously, when it comes to issues, we focus on what are the most significant issues that we noted while we were conducting that assessment. So in doing the review on Calendly, the time zone selection drop down was obviously a big point of note. But had we have found issues that were so significant that it made it impossible to complete the task, we would have given it a red rating, and those issues would have been reflected in the accessibility issues as well. And so that ultimately is what ProcureEnsure is. It is a quick 2 to 3 hour assessment conducted by one of our live auditing teams, including a live user with disabilities. It will give you a high-level color-coded rating of what our feeling of the overall accessibility is based on that review that we conducted. And it will outline several high-level accessibility issues and several accessibility features. And so obviously, if we give it a green rating, we won't include accessibility issues. If we gave it a red rating, then there won't likely be any accessibility features. So that will depend a little bit based on what the actual findings is. But that is ProcureEnsure in a nutshell. Ryan, I guess I'll head it back to you.
Yeah, no, and I did type one response in, and I saw that was appreciated, so that is amazing. And then AP, one question that came in from Charity as you were speaking, we talked a little bit about VPAT validation. is what if we request HECVATs? So I'm assuming they as an internal organization, I don't know where charity is from at the moment, but they obviously request HECVATs instead of BPATs, I would assume. So any thoughts on that? I mean, I can safely assume we could review that as part of ProcureEnsure, but I'll defer to you.
I would think so. I'm honestly not familiar with HECVATs. So I would need to look into that to see exactly what it is that we are talking about there. But presumably we would be able to, if ultimately it's a document that outlines the accessibility conformance, whether it's based on the EU laws and regulations or WCAG, that would be something we'd be able to review.
Perfect. Thank you. And then we got another great question. I can't see the name. It says anonymous attendee. But this is a really good question. And AP, I know this is one that we have talked a ton about internally and are working on building out. And that is, I assume multiple organizations will be asking you to test the same tools. And I would agree, depending on sort of verticals, et cetera. If we request a ProcureEnsure test for something you've already tested, will you provide those prior testing results, or will you have a resource portal essentially for us to look these up? So that is something, AP, we've spent a lot of time discussing. We are building out sort of a place to house these. We do have a very robust customer portal called Hub here at Allyant. Pretty natural integration for us to have a ProcureEnsure portal within Hub. So our team is sort of working on that and mapping that out. But this is a great question. And the short answer that I'm generally telling organizations is yes. And I think AP, as we've talked about, it sort of depends on the timing, right? I think it's just like a VPAT. Like if someone has a VPAT from 6 years ago, that the software might look totally different. So I think this is a great question. I think in short, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is, I think, two things. One, how recently had we done the ProcureEnsure assessment? And then are the features of the product that is looking to be procured the same? And I think we've run into that challenge a little bit. We have done an assessment on the same product twice now, recently. And one of the variables was the first time we did ProcureEnsure, they were looking to use a certain feature set. And some of these platforms and systems are very large. These products are very robust. And the next organization was looking to use a totally different feature set. So that vendor set us up with sort of different access. But AP, anything to add to that? I think that's a really phenomenal question. And we're sort of working on that in background.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. The biggest question is going to be timing. How long has it been since we've conducted a ProcureEnsure assessment on it? I think if it's more than 4 or 6 months, it's likely that we'll end up just doing a new assessment for you to make sure that everything is really remaining up to date. Long term, we have had discussions about trying to get a portal or something established for people to be able to access that. But that is something that might hopefully be coming down the pipeline later on. And then just as you also said about the specific functionality, because ultimately when we go to do one of these ProcureEnsure assessments, one of the questions that we ask is, what are you planning on doing with this tool? Understanding how you're planning on using it lets us focus our testing to try to really emulate or to test what it is that you're going to be actually using the software for. And so if we are being asked to test the same piece of software, but because it wants to be used in a different way, we may end up providing a different assessment as a result of that.
Perfect. Yeah, great question. And so then moving on, and then I see some questions flowing in, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. I think I built a little, FAQs on ProcureEnsure. So I'll take a few of these. AP, actually, you've covered very well. What if the provider provides a VPAT, so we don't have to go through that FAQ. I'll start at the bottom on my slide deck again if you are happening to follow along on the slide deck, and that is one of the most common questions I've got at a lot of these conversations is, do you have procurement language and tools as part of this service? And the short answer and the easy answer to that is we do not here at Allyant, but the Disability In team, and specifically their Procure Access toolkit, is absolutely fantastic. They have a lot of this contract language more from a pure procurement perspective in procuring accessible technology. They've worked with a lot of accessibility leaders in the space, so we would be happy if you reach out to connect you with the Disability In team or point you to sort of the Procure Access toolkit to sort of solve that side of the challenge. As far as the other FAQ, and I did answer one question in the chat on this, is the age-old question that we've gotten every time of why is this free? And quite frankly, from our perspective, two things. And I think transparency is always important. One is we are a corporate partner of Disability In. We are huge proponents of the stuff that Disability In is doing. And we saw in sort of a gap in something that they are doing that's really helping the market that we could help fill. We could fill that void. And so that was really where ProcureEnsure came from, was talking with the disability in team and really talking with the disability in community on where is Procure Access becoming a challenge or what is sort of the gap there. And so we kind of talked about that. So that was the number one thing, really standing up as a corporate partner and sort of living out that corporate partner mentality of disability and in the amazing work that they're doing. The second is, and again, in full transparency, a lot of times we can help drive third-party accessibility that in AP, this is a common sort of topic here at Allyant, and it was at A360 for many years, of third parties, right? Even whether it's us doing an audit of a site and we find issues or we find a third party that has accessibility issues, many times our clients or the team that's deploying that can't fix that, right? And we have long believed that that has to flow through that third party. And ProcureEnsure is kind of a natural integration into that, right? We don't have to charge our clients to test those third parties in many cases, whether it be in procurement, in renewal, or as we're going through that audit process. We can provide a free service that allows them to go back to those vendors, take that legal risk off of them, and also put it back on the vendor to drive accessibility, which ultimately tends to create a lot of warm introductions for us here at Allyant. Anything to add to that, AP, specifically on the third-party topic? I know it's always a hot question or comment here at Allyant.
Yeah, it definitely is. And really when you get into the legal space around it, if you're just a typical website, an e-commerce website, hosting an e-commerce website, and you have a third-party tool, the question of whether or not you are going to be liable for the accessibility issues created by that third-party tool is very up in the air. There is not a solid answer one way or the other. And so it really could depend. And so since you don't have the ability to control these very often, it really is essential to get those vendors on board with actually responding to those accessibility issues. And that's where ProcureEnsure can really come into play, because you can then go back to your vendor and say, here is a report from an accessibility vendor in the space. Here they've given you a rating. Here they've outlined a few reasons as to why you were given the rating that you were given, and really begin to move the accessibility conversation with that vendor forward from there.
Absolutely. Thank you, AP, for tagging on. With that, I'll kind of jump to sort of like questions and how Allyant can help. So we do have a webpage for ProcureEnsure, obviously, Allyant.com/ProcureEnsure. We'll also be sending that out as part of the follow-up with the webinar, and then also just a link to that page. You can contact us anytime at info@allyant.com. You can chat with us on our website. However you want to get in touch with us, we would be happy to chat further about ProcureEnsure and how we can help launch this for your team to kick off 2024. With that, another common question that I get and something we've recently built is an intake form. So one of the common questions or challenges that we were having with ProcureEnsure assessments on behalf of our clients that are very actively using this is, what do we need to ask our vendors? How can we make this efficient for you all to do the testing? So we have actually built a fairly seamless intake form that kind of just gets AP and his team the information they need to provide this assessment. And it's been very well received by our clients and made performing ProcureEnsure is much more seamless and efficient. So we'd be happy to get that to you as well as part of those conversations. With that, I'd love to kind of just open up to any final questions from anyone that's on the line. And I'm actually looking at the Q&A right now as well, AP. So Mike asked a question, I don't know necessarily related to ProcureEnsure, but Michael Mace, you asked, what does the portal look like? Can we see a demo? Absolutely not on this call, because I think AP and I both have to jump off after the webinar proceeds, but be happy to give anyone a demo of our Alliance Hub. It's a very robust portal that really is how we deliver audits to our clients. So it includes obviously our auditing results, recommended fixes, prioritization of accessibility issues. We have an extremely robust knowledge base. We have automated testing through that tool as well. So yeah, Michael, at any time, we'd be happy to provide a further demo on our Alliance Hub portal if you reach out to our team. And then one question that we got, AP, was, would you do a review of a software already in use by an organization? Yeah, this is a great question. And quite frankly, initially, I think when we launched ProcureEnsure, we were thinking about I'll call it and I'm not a procurement expert, so bear with me, the historical procurement process, right? RFP, RFI, looking for a new vendor. This is an anonymous attendee, so I can't see your name. But yeah, this is a great question. We absolutely can review anything that's also being leveraged today, and we're seeing a lot of our clients leverage this at renewal, right? So whether it's renewal or procuring something new, we certainly can do a ProcureEnsure assessment on existing software that you are already using. Anything to add to that, AP? I think pretty straightforward though.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. In fact, it might actually in those situations be a little bit easier since you already have the software, you have access to it, you already have it deployed, you have an instance of it ready to go. So that it can eliminate the need to work with the vendor to arrange a testing environment, that type of things when it's already in use. So in fact, you may find that in that situation, it might go a little bit even quicker.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great point. And then the other question that's sitting in here is, how do you initiate procurement how do you initiate a procurement? Geez, tongue twister, with ProcureEnsure. So great question. Like I said, you can reach out to our team, fill out our web form chat, like get to us in some way, ping AP or I on LinkedIn, and sort of request a demo of ProcureEnsure and sort of how we do that. Beyond that, and I can't see your name either. What we would do from there is sort of provide you with that intake form and kind of talk you through if there's any fields on there that you'd like to add, anything that was missing. We're going to just talk through the full process. And then outside of that, once we get those requests from our clients and get everything set up from a vendor perspective, we're off and running. And like we talked about, generally provide that back in 5 to 7 business days. So fairly easy. We can run you through that on a quick demo. We'll get you that intake form, get you all the details that your internal team needs to leverage the service, and you'd be off and running. Any final questions? I'm not seeing any. So with that, I certainly, on behalf of AP and I, we appreciate everybody jumping on. If you have any questions afterwards, always reach out. As we alluded to, info@allyant.com. Ping us on our website, sales@allyant.com. However you want to get in touch with us, we'd be happy to answer any and all questions, talk you deeper through the ProcureEnsure service and how we can support your procurement team with procuring accessible technology. And with that, I think on behalf of us, AP, I'd like to wish everybody a happy holidays, a fantastic rest of 2023. And yeah, we look forward to chatting with you further in the future.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks so.